We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Trumpism 2.0 offers both danger and opportunity. Trumpism 1.0 was built around being tough with China. And while that's no longer a rhetorical priority for the big man, much of what was started in 2016 has since become the accepted wisdom in DC. Today, Trumpism 2.0 is as much about American competitiveness in an international market that has slipped farther away from its hegemon across the last 8 years. It's about deregulation, DOGE, and developing strategic dominance in the emerging fields of AI, weapons tech, and genetics. We're in for 4 years of great power competition with China against the background of a new focus on US competitiveness. Almost no one spans these subjects as elegantly as Steve Hsu, a professor of theoretical physics, startup founder, and one of the most prominent members of the new counter-elite that has recently emerged from the high-tech world of America's West Coast to challenge the status quo in Washington, D.C. Steve's research has included black holes and quantum information, dark energy, quantum gravity, and quark matter. He's also contributed to the field of genetics, especially on the construction of genomic predictors of complex human traits. Steve has founded several startups, including Othram, a company that uses DNA sequencing to help solve hot and cold criminal and missing persons cases, Genetic Prediction, which pioneered polygenic screening for embryos in IVF, and most recently Superfocus, an enterprise GPT that uses large language models for language capability. Somehow, he also finds time to host Manifold, one of the world's most interesting podcasts and a must-listen for those who wish to keep abreast of the ideas and knowledge of the Silicon Valley and VC world. Steve Hsu.
It's great to be on the show, and I want you guys to know that the YouTube algorithm knows that I listen to your show via YouTube. So I don't know where you get the pattern, the design for your kind of screen, but it's this blue multicolored thing that I have a fond affection for.
Oh, that's great to hear. I'm very happy to hear that, Steve. I was actually listening to Manifold recently, and I was absolutely fascinated by your kind of travel diary, if you like, or a little kind of digest of your experiences in China recently, your visits with folks in academia and the startup world. But I think more than that, your kind of image of what it's like to live in one of these first-tier Chinese cities like Shanghai or Beijing. And I thought it might be a good place to start to really talk about how China's changed over the last 10 years. We mentioned earlier that I very briefly passed through Beijing about 10, 15 years ago, and your description was entirely different from my experience. And it sounds very much that China is changing socially as much as it's changing economically, or developing as much socially as it is economically. Maybe you could share with people, just give them an overview of what China's like, what it's like to live there, what the economy's like, how progressive or futuristic or productive it is, what's the startup world like? Because what we get from the mainstream media tends to be very broad and fits in a very specific narrative.
Great. Yes. So the 2 episodes I recorded while I was on this trip, it was a 3-week trip. One is entitled Letter from Beijing, which was recorded in Beijing. And the second one, which just released a few days ago, is called Letter from Shanghai. And that was recorded on the last day of my trip in Shanghai. I've been traveling to China since the early 90s. So at that time, the only place you could go was this special economic zone, which later evolved into Shenzhen. And you're absolutely right that the actual culture and society have evolved radically in the last, in your case, 15 years, but over the 30 years or so that I've been traveling there. I would put it this way. I think, one way to say it is just in terms of metrics. So if you look at the generation that built China from a communist, state-controlled economy into this sort of free market behemoth that it is now, that generation, say people who were coming of age in the 90s, only a few percent of that population was able to go to college. And in fact, many of them didn't have a thorough K through 12 education because of the Cultural Revolution. They were very poor. They were many inches shorter on average than kids today. So one of the key metrics you can look at in the economic development of a country is height, because as nutrition gets better, the amount of protein people get, minerals, et cetera, they tend to be much taller. And so you can see, someone was joking with me because on my Twitter feed, I was posting photos the whole time I was there. And I posted some photos from a luxury mall in Shanghai where the stores were things like Cartier and Gucci, things like this. And someone joked that in China, it's great to see a whole family out because the height differential between the grandmother and then the son who's say in his 50s and his teenage son is very extreme. And that sort of just captures the whole story. Now, in terms of people's behavior, you have to remember what happened here. You had an economy which was state-led, and people were all wearing Mao suits, riding bicycles. And in 30 years, that transformed into, in some sense, one of the most technologically advanced economies and societies in the world. At an everyday level, it's in a sense more futuristic than anything you find in Europe or the US. People regularly ride on high-speed trains. They use their phones to pay for everything. You can use your face to pay for things or to gain access to the subway, things like this. All that change happened so fast that it also led to changes in the way people behave, people treat each other. And so like you, when I traveled there, say in 2010, I was used to kind of a big dichotomy between the highly educated class, like if I met with a banker or dean of a college or professor, I was expecting that person to be very, well-behaved, well-mannered, also familiar with lots of Western ideas. But the average person was nothing like that. The average person was poorly educated and, just happy to get enough food or something, and living in a pretty terrible apartment usually. That has changed a lot. So people now are much more polite. You see it in sort of simple behaviors like queuing. Like 10, 20 years ago, people wouldn't queue. They would just sort of rush as a crowd to try to get to the head of the pack to get what they wanted. Now it's a very polite society. It's not quite at the level of Japan, but it's just short of that. I would say in terms of like just the daily politeness and social organization, it's very similar to what you would find in Taiwan or South Korea. Very recently, this is the first trip back that I've made since COVID. I was there in 2019, and then I didn't travel there during COVID, and now I'm going back for the first time. One of the things that really struck me is that the prevalence of surveillance cameras, which I think is maybe only equaled in London, is so high that it's become a high trust society. There's very little crime now. People claim, I didn't try it myself, but people claim you can leave your phone and laptop on the table at the cafe when you go to the toilet and no one will touch it. I did verify that bicycles have only the flimsiest locks now in China. I saw many vending machines which were honor code vending machines. So it's like a big refrigerator with lots of bottles of different drinks in there. And you go up and you take what you want, and then you scan with your phone and pay using, say, WeChat or Alipay, and you pay for what you took. And there's no other security other than that. So things are really transforming fast there. It's very tough for Westerners to get their brains around it because, as I said in the letter from Shanghai, if you haven't been there, even if you were very expert on China 15 years ago, but you hadn't kept up in the last 15 years and you go there now, you'll be quite shocked. If you're not able to travel to China, I would recommend that you do if you're thinking of a vacation where you're going to enjoy it and also learn a lot of stuff. I think China actually is a good candidate because there's a lot of historical stuff to see. There's a huge variation in climates. There are these super futuristic megacities, but there are also rural, unspoiled areas you can visit. I would suggest you go there. And what the Chinese government did is they opened the visa policies quite a bit. So now people from many European countries, for example, can go there. I think it was like a 2-week limit without a visa, and now I think they're extending it to a month. So you can just go there if you're say probably like a German or something. You can just fly to China and just travel around. And as a consequence, there is a huge amount of content now on YouTube, you wouldn't notice this unless you look specifically at travel videos or travel logs, and specifically travel logs of people who maybe like to go to quote exotic places from the Western perspective. But if you do look for it, you just do a simple search, like, recent China vlog or travel log, you'll find almost an infinite amount of content from creators who are taking advantage of this kind of open visa policy in China. And from that, you'll just see immediately how much it's changed and how it's very, very different from Western media depictions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I've watched some of that stuff on YouTube. China's not a closed society anymore at all, and I think people need to kind of update their software in that regard. I haven't been myself. I'm hoping to go in 2025, but I have been working quite a bit with Chinese people. Maybe you could say something on how the Chinese kind of view themselves. My sense is that, as you said, up until quite recently, maybe 15 years ago, I can't put a date on it, I wasn't there, Chinese society had probably gone down a few pegs because of the Mao era. I mean, it was a kind of brutal period. I'm not surprised it instilled people the notion that you had to grab the bread before the bread ran out. That's not surprising. But of course, they're not building on nothing. China is a civilization. I mean, it's a very major civilization in the world. And certainly the Chinese people that I interact with, you definitely have a sense that this isn't some kind of like wrecked communist place that then they had to rebuild from year zero. This is a civilizational power. So maybe you could say something about Chinese self-conception. I mean, especially in a world that's changing so fast and that they're about to take a major role in.
This is a really great question. That's also one of the reasons I watch your show regularly or listen to your show regularly. This question of not just Chinese, but East Asian self-image vis-a-vis the West and how it's evolved over time is a very deep question. And if you talk to intellectuals from Japan or Korea or China, they have it's a subject that's been explored a lot. And you can go very deep on this. In the case of China, you have to throw in, as you said, this extra era of communism, right? So you had sort of Western imperialism, but then you had communism. And now after a lengthy period, a heroic period. So if you look at how hard people worked to build China after Deng opened the economy, it's just unbelievable. Like, you can't really believe like what people went through. Now the best way I would characterize it is a quiet self-confidence. So they now feel like they no longer worry about catching up with the West or even getting ahead of the West in certain technical areas. They really don't worry about it. They feel quietly confident. And interestingly, there's a resurgence of interest in their deep civilizational state. This will be shocking to most Westerners, but even in some more remote areas, you'll see young people wearing what look to us like costumes. They're called Han Fu. These are historical costumes like from Tang Dynasty or Song Dynasty China. Young men and women will dress up in this stuff. In a way, it's a little bit like anime cosplay, but it's different. These people are deliberately expressing their confidence and interest in the deep history and culture of China. And it's a relatively new phenomenon, but it's very popular. So at any given moment, if I were walking through the metro in a fairly big city, I could look around, and after a few minutes of walking, I would definitely see some people in Hanfu. That's a very vivid illustration of how they're sort of embracing their own history and civilizational state, and they have a higher sense of confidence than they did in the past.
That's extremely interesting, actually, this idea of confidence in one's own civilization, especially with the way that we hear sometimes the very senior elites within China view China as a civilizational state as much as a nation state. Just moving on to the economy, Steve, I think there are two very different schools of thought on China. There are people like perhaps myself and Philip who see China as not only a rapidly growing economy, but an economy that is rapidly moving up the value chain and actually taking leadership positions now in a whole range of industrial areas that are at the very at kind of the pointy end of human progress, as well as to a certain degree in education. And we think because of that, the economy is going to continue on something like its current trajectory. But on the other hand, you have folks who believe that China is, forever on the verge of collapse or maybe at its peak now and it's going to start descending, at least in relative terms, in the world. And I suppose their arguments, the kind of the bearish argument for China, can be split into two camps. The first I would call the Michael Pettis camp, which is based on the idea that China privileges investment far too much over consumption. And because it runs a constant and huge current account surplus, eventually it's going to have to rebalance its economy if it's going to continue generating growth. And that rebalancing process will be extremely painful, something like that which Japan has faced since the 1990s. The second bearish argument for China is what I would perhaps call the Peter Zeihan argument, which is that China has already entered a demographic doom loop. And that, in combination with its geographical disadvantages, will ultimately lead to some sort of collapse, I think Peter Zeihan argues. But others perhaps might argue just a declining relevance in the world. What are your views on that? While it has issues, is going to continue progressing forward because of these underlying fundamentals? Or is it something that has already reached its peak and is now on the decline, as Pettis and Zeihan would argue, for different reasons?
So let me start with Zeihan, which, by the way, I would classify this group of people, maybe not Pettis so much, but I would classify this group of people like Zeihan and others that you're going to encounter on Twitter or on the internet as China doomers, right? So they would assert that we're already past peak China and the future for China is kind of bleak. And
by the way, don't feel that you have to hold your punches. Like I, last week in our 100th episode special called Peter Zeihan the Jim Cramer of geopolitics. So
yeah, I'll just state my case, and then listeners can decide what they find convincing or what they find interesting and worthy of further research. The demographic challenge to China is real. So like all developed countries, so if you look at any developed country and you specifically look at the subset of people in that country that are highly educated and able, the most capable subset of the population, you'll rarely find TFR, total fertility rate, so that's the number of children that average woman will have in her lifetime. You rarely find TFR much above 1. Okay, so people might say, oh, in the US, we're close to 2, but you have to look carefully at who's having those babies. The highly capable part of the US population is at 1, like in China and these East Asian countries. And so it's a challenge for everyone. Now, having said that, it's a challenge that the Communist Party or the government there has to address, I would say, roughly on a 20-year time scale. They have about a 20-year time scale to deal with this problem. And the reason I say that, now you have to look at the real numbers. Kids that have just been born now, so we know how big the 2023 and 2024 birth cohorts were in China, right? Those are people that are going to be entering the workforce in about 20 years. So you can actually make a very detailed projection of what human capital looks like in China over the next 20 years. After that, of course, it depends on to what extent the government fixes, the current problems in demography, birth rates, et cetera. But for the next 20 years, I can confidently project that the human capital pool in China is going to get much stronger, actually, over the next 20 years than what they currently have. So let's break it down. The people that are 60-ish years old and they're retiring, as I said earlier, that population, only a few percent of that population was able to go to college. And contrast that with kids today who are 20 years old, say, about 60% of those kids were able to go on to college level education. And the probability that one of those kids who goes on to higher training is doing a STEM degree, a rigorous STEM degree, is about 2x or more higher than in the US. Okay? So they're turning out in a way, one way to estimate it is something like an order of magnitude more highly trained STEM workers than, say, the US. And it's comparable to the rest. If you actually detailed calculation, there's a German academic, you can see that like the high ability, highly able population in China that's going to enter the workforce in the next 20 years is literally like the rest of the world combined. And if you just calculate the deepening of their human capital pool, it's very clearly happening. Now, if you look at specific cases, you look at the team at BYD that works on their batteries, or you look at the Chinese Space Agency team that landed a rover on Mars. Okay, only the US and China have managed soft landings on Mars. You look at that team, it's very young. The team leader might be in their early 30s, mid 30s. Many people on the team are late 20s, early 30s. So those people have 20 super productive years ahead of them. And that's pretty much the case everywhere in China. You look at their chip design teams, you look at their semiconductor teams, you look at software teams, it's all pretty much young people. They have a lot of productive years ahead of them. And this next 20 years will continue to pump out similar, actually increasing numbers of highly trained people into their economy. It's just a matter of them having become more affluent and having set up a pretty good system of education and universities. So that's my response to Zehan. If you say like, oh, we got to catch up with them in hypersonics because we fell behind. Okay, great. How is that going to be easy? It's not going to be easy because they have plenty of people to staff their hypersonics teams. They have plenty of people to staff their jet engine research teams. They have plenty of people to staff their semiconductor teams. It's a very daunting task if you're serious about this question and you actually do quantitative estimates of the human capital pool and the financial capital pool that they have access to. As long as things are not run really badly there, they're going to be very formidable, at least for the next 20 years. Okay, so that's maybe you can, if you want to follow up on the Zehan demography point, maybe I'll just pause there.
I'd just firm up, definitely. I think 20 years is about the right time. You've kind of made the case for high end, and for lower end stuff, people just have to understand 40% of people are still in the agricultural sector in China, and the equilibrium agricultural rate for a developed economy is like 2%. And even if Chinese land completely sucks, like maybe it's 4%. So, 2% population growth a year, you need 2% to come into the city. Okay, you got about 20 years to sort out your demographics problem. I'd also say, I mean, if anyone's going to sort out a demographics problem from a kind of state-led kind of thing, it's probably going to be the Chinese state. They seem to have the most effective state machinery in the world. Some people complain about it, but, in terms of personal liberty and so on, but they do seem to have that. I mean, I guess I'd ask, since you've been there recently, demographics is one of those funny things where I guess interpersonal relationships actually kind of matter as well as the kind of statistics and so on. From the YouTube videos that you were talking about earlier, I think I've got a little bit of a sense of it, but do you have any sense of what the sociological drivers of their low birth rates are? I mean, I know we can say every society has low birth rates, but definitely from actually having done some formal work in this, I've learned that it's kind of like, every happy family's the same. The old, I think it's, who is it? I can't remember, the Russian author.
Tolstoy.
Tolstoy, but all unhappy families are unhappy in a different way. And with TFR, it's the same. It's like the drivers of South Korean low birth rates, sociologically speaking, are very different from the drivers of American or British. Do you have any sense of what the drivers are in China and, the general cultural dynamics about it? Is it to do with a collapse in arranged marriages? Is it to do with a collapse in rural traditional families? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, actually, so you made a number of good points. So let me amplify what you're saying about the low end, because I didn't really address it. And you're right, it's important. China is not as urbanized as other equally developed countries. So there's still a reserve of people that are still in agricultural, low productivity work that still will eventually migrate to the cities. And so that's actually another pool of economic growth. Or related to that is the fact that China has now surpassed, I believe, Japan and Germany, or at least is at parity with Japan and Germany in terms of the number of robots per worker. Per 1,000 workers or 10,000 workers, there are metrics that track deployment of robotics in, say, manufacturing and other areas. And so I think only South Korea right now has more workers per capita than China, and China's catching up very fast. And in addition to that, like if you then drill down, you say, where are these robots being purchased from? China's increasingly making the actual robots that it's deploying domestically. So it's not even having to buy them from some German or Japanese company. It's actually making them internally. A lot of these things affect like how serious a demographic shortfall would be in terms of the labor supply and stuff like that. Now, as you said, they have more state power there than most other countries. So maybe the state will be able to like re-engineer things so that the TFR goes up. I wouldn't necessarily bet on this. I think as a phenomenon, global phenomenon, it does seem like a hard thing to beat. And I think we will face a decline in reproductive rates for at least the highly capable parts of different populations. I think that's kind of baked in a little bit. Now, in terms of the reasons for what's going on in China, I think it's actually pretty easy to identify, like, because you can find cases where people survey the young population, young women in particular. You can also find sort of more anecdotal surveys online where people go around and just ask women what their plans are for kids, how many kids they'd like to have, why they haven't had kids yet, et cetera. And it's very clearly in China economic and competitive pressure. People feel like they can't have the kid because it's so expensive to raise the kid, and the society is very competitive. It's not quite at the level of, say, South Korea right now, but for the elites, it is kind of like that. So you think like, oh, I'm going to have this kid, but I have to get the kid into one of the really good schools, and then I have to pay for tutors to help this kid. It just goes on and on. A lot of people just don't want to do it, or they just don't feel they have the means. They don't want to have a kid before they have the means to support the kid at, quote, an appropriate level. And I think that's the main driver reducing the TFR. The government has consciously, Xi Jinping has consciously tried to fix this problem by doing things like they actually cap the amount of resources that families can devote to things like tutoring. So they've actually outlawed certain kinds of tutoring. It really crashed the educational, a bunch of companies that are focused on the educational space in China. It put a bunch of tutors out of work. It's a whole thing, if you're familiar with Chinese culture, that happened in the last, 5 years. And they literally did that so that average families that don't make as much money don't feel under as much pressure to compete with families with more resources. So the government is trying. Whether this is going to work, I don't know. But I don't want to make predictions out more than this sort of 20-year time frame that I described.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, in terms of the actual macroeconomic side rather than the demographic side, and specifically Pettis's critique of the Chinese economic model, I think you've spoken on several podcasts before that you're not necessarily persuaded by Michael Pettis's critique of the Chinese economic model. Can you explain why that is? I mean, what is it that you find unpersuasive about that?
Yeah, so there's two aspects. Now, some people, I think after in Letter to Beijing, I spoke to a guy whose pseudonym is Han Feize, who writes for the Asia Times. And he and Pettis are actually antagonists, sort of debate each other online a little bit. Interestingly, this guy that I spoke to, I can't reveal his identity, he has an investment banking background, and he at one point employed Michael Pettis, rather amusingly. So anyway, they know each other quite well. Let me put it this way. There are two critiques one can make, one which I agree with and one I don't agree with. The critique I agree with is that the Chinese government is deliberately practicing a kind of mercantilism, which is repressing the average consumer in China. So they are putting in place policies that sort of limit consumption and increase investment in the economy, in the productive economy. So they have been doing that. The simplest way to see that is to look at the difference between the PPP dollar RMB relative valuation and the actual FX, foreign exchange rate. And almost everybody who studies this, whether you're at the World Bank or you're just some tourist walking around China, you realize that on a purchasing power parity basis, the yuan is undervalued by something like 2x. And if you compare the US and the Chinese economy using that factor, using PPP basis, the economy there is 1.5 times as large as the US economy. A consequence of that, though, is because the actual exchange rate is suppressed, it makes it easier for them to sell their products. So it makes their products cheaper on the global market, but it makes the buying power of the average consumer in China less than what it otherwise would be. So on this particular point, I do agree. The government has a conscious strategy to build its capabilities, build its market share, take over certain key sectors in business. And they don't mind if the people have less disposable income or are practicing less consumption during this buildup period. When this buildup period will end, I do not know. What I'm giving you is just a descriptive analysis. there's a second normative analysis where you could say, oh, it's terrible that they're suppressing the Chinese consumer. Why can't the Chinese consumer be like the American consumer, where you just buy tons of junk to the point where Americans live in McMansions and most people can't park their car in their garage because they have so much shit in their garage that it's full of stuff they've purchased over the years, and they park their car outside. It's very common in California, for example. So if you say that's a desirable end state, that the fundamental productive capabilities, i.e. number of robots in factories, capabilities to make semiconductors, vertical integration of supply chains, it's just more important that people accumulate more trash and more junk in their garage. But I think the viewpoint of the government there is we were playing catch up. We were very poor. We're still poor on a per capita basis. So the GDP per capita in China is still catching up to the US. We can suck it up a little while longer. We don't need to unleash consumption quite as much as a Western person looking at China would think is quote normal. But eventually it might happen, right? And I don't think the government has a specific plan for how a transition to greater consumption is going to happen. They've tried little things along the way, but not really with a kind of the full force of their power. But what they have tried to do under Xi is shift to a high quality economy. So trying to move up the value chain, trying to become dominant in certain key technologies and industries. So that's clearly their strategy. So they have a strategy. The other part of the Pettis critique is that these massive investments that the government is able to make because of, in part, repression of consumers is wasted. So it's non-productive investment. And there I disagree with Pettis. So there you have to do very careful analysis where, of course, at a superficial level, one can easily identify projects that are a mess. Like you go to some little provincial city and you realize the mayor there decided to plow $500 million into some museum or some white elephant project that is probably not going to turn out to be useful. Or some huge real estate company invested in a bunch of apartments and they mistimed it. There was a bubble going on and it looks like these apartments are not going to be occupied for many years after when they originally projected they would be occupied. So in any big complex economy, you can find examples of misallocated resources. That's true here as well, right? So every venture capitalist knows 8 or 9 out of 10 of the startups they invest in are going to be failures, right? So it's not difficult to find failure examples. That's different from asking what is the total ROI? What is the aggregate ROI from the activity? And I would say on balance, the Chinese have done okay in terms of ROI for the investment that they've made. Like kind of near the end, this last 10-ish period, like leading up to Xi taking over and then a little bit into his first years in office as the paramount leader, probably they were making too much cement. Probably they were making too much steel, too many steel girders for buildings, right? So economies always overshoot, right? So I think that did happen. But by and large, now, if you are actually a technologist, which for sure Pettis is not, okay? If you are actually a technologist and you understand where various countries are in their capabilities in any particular vertical, you choose a vertical and then you say like, well, okay, what can they do in this country? What products can they make that are competitive? On that kind of analysis, China is doing very well. And so like, in a way, like I just don't care. Like if Pettis can say like they're about to collapse, they're probably not about to collapse because the government has quite a few levers to influence the economy. But he doesn't like their macro breakup of different numbers right now. But to me, fundamentally, you went from a country which could not produce things at the leading edge, high value add products. Now there's almost no high value add product that they cannot make cheaper and better than the rest of the world. And like that delta was caused by the very investment that Pettis doesn't like. So I think it's just very kind of economists. I'm a critic of economists because I think they understand one thing. They can add some numbers up. That's the limit of their capability, but they really don't understand science and technology very well.
Well, just to defend the economists for 1 second, I think it comes to the question of whether you take a very kind of Austrian economics view of investment or you take a non-Austrian economist, probably a Keynesian view, really. And I guess the Austrian view is it needs to be very disciplined. There needs to be a great deal of discipline on investment. And if you don't have that discipline, you'll turn into Zimbabwe or something like that. Whereas I guess the more Keynesian view is overinvestment is always better than underinvestment. And I really think China's proved that view. That doesn't mean that you then therefore buy into government stimulus versus austerity, whatever. Those are separate debates. But in terms of investment, the old debates that took place after World War II were approximately that. I'd also kind of highlight what you're saying, because I think you put it really well there, about the fact that the renminbi or the yuan is chronically undervalued. The thing is that the people I don't think fully understand is that when you go and you look at Chinese GDP on a dollar basis, we have a lot of this now. We have a lot of people kind of coming out and saying, yeah, China's still like 30% behind the United States. Look at this dollar-based GDP. And like every economist knows, you're not supposed to use dollar-based GDP. You're supposed to use PPP adjusted, which, as you say, they're substantially larger economy. What that valuation means is that if the Chinese government change their policy on the renminbi, Chinese consumption will go up very, very rapidly, and Chinese income per capita will go up extremely rapidly as well. There's a lot of pent-up consumption in the economy that's being artificially, call it what you want, suppressed. So I think even the people who are like, first of all, they kind of BS you on the dollar GDP, which they're not supposed to use. Then they finally transition to the PPP one and they go, okay, China's actually a lot bigger than the US. Then the next step is they move on and they say, yeah, well, it's still poor. Look at the per capita GDP. And I'm like, well, that per capita GDP could literally shoot up in like 5 years if they change their policies. I really think that's a good thing to highlight to listeners.
Yeah, so just to comment on that last part, and no offense to economists, I know a lot of economists.
They do kind of suck. I totally agree with you as an economist.
Well, I exaggerate the point sometimes, but as you British guys would say, I like to take the piss from the economists sometimes. Let's imagine a future where China leads in photovoltaics, they lead in EVs, they lead in batteries, they lead in a bunch of critical technologies, and maybe they're even going to catch up in semiconductors and AI technology, et cetera. So imagine this future where the Huawei phone is actually every bit as good or maybe better than the Apple phone, and it sells for 20% less. Okay. Same with the car, same with the giant turbine that you use to build your power plant, all kinds of things. At that point, maybe the government feels comfortable and they say, we no longer have to compete purely on price. For most of this history of opening up since Deng, we had to compete on price. So the exchange rate we had to keep suppressed. Now we feel comfortable. We feel confident. This might happen in 10 years or something, right? Or maybe sooner. And they just say like, yeah, we're just going to gradually allow this sort of controlled exchange rate to move in the favor of Chinese consumers. And then all of a sudden you'll see some crazy thing. Like in 5 years, the GDP per capita doubles. The nominal GDP per capita doubles and the buying power of consumers just doubles in China. Of course, there are a bunch of second order effects and you have to analyze exactly how this would work, but it's not implausible, right? That they could just stop suppressing the exchange rate after they reach a certain level of maturity in economic and technological development. So to me, that's very plausible that could happen.
I suppose another point about this was, I think it was David Goldman who raised this point, but forgive me if it's not. David Goldman also writes for the Asia Times, I believe. Very interesting thinker. And he made the point with regard to some of the overinvestment that something similar happened in the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. The example he used was the Chinese high-speed rail system, which is built out at an unbelievable and almost unimaginable rate over the I think they've got something like 130,000 kilometers of high-speed rail at the moment, or something along those lines. And we're now seeing headlines in places like The Economist and the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times wondering whether China can still go on building all of this and that some of these are white elephants. But David Goldman, again, I think it was him, made the point that something similar happened in the US where maybe you did get overinvestment. You also had people like JP Morgan and Vanderbilt were involved in consolidating that overinvestment. Some companies went out of business, some succeeded. But at the end, you still had a whole bunch of railroad, which was really useful for the development of the United States. It might be the same with the car industry in China. You have these kind of 1,000 flowers blooming, hundreds of different car companies competing with each other, and especially now within the electric vehicle segment. And maybe some of them will go out of business. Maybe some will have to be consolidated together to compete. Some will succeed, no doubt. But still, you'll have this amazing fantastic car industry at the end of it, right? I mean, is this not just the way that developing economies develop? I mean, I don't know. Unlike Philip, I'm not a practitioner of the dismal science of economics, but
I would say, first of all, I'm a strong believer in the fact that in general, central planning isn't going to be able to defeat market forces and such. And so it's not surprising that they could overshoot a little bit and there are too many EV companies and there's going to be a period of consolidation, et cetera. I think you're absolutely right about that. The important thing, and this is analyzed a lot if AI gets to the point where Chinese to English translation is flawless, suddenly you'll have like a huge corpus of knowledge that you'll have access to where discussions of points like this one in particular are very sophisticated and you'll suddenly have access to this. You'll be able to read it. What the Chinese people say, and these are typically engineers, venture capitalists, serious people, is you'll notice that when one of the EV makers or battery makers in China goes under, the assets are put to work immediately by, there's some process, some other company takes them over, and none of it's wasted. The factory gets turned back on because there isn't that much difference in what they're building. So that the same infrastructure, for the failed EV company can be put to work by BYD after BYD buys them out. And so the level of wasted investment is actually much lower than people might think if you're not familiar with the industries.
I suppose then, after all this talk about China's development, its social development, its economic development, we ought to move on to how the United States is responding to the growth of China, the expansion of China and its appearance as a serious global player, as a great power within a multipolar system. And I think what most people, or the policy that most people would associate with that response from Washington would be Washington's various attempts to restrict Chinese access to the technological drivers of economic growth. So that would be at first sanctions on Huawei, and especially related to its 5G business, its ability to get microchips for its phones, etc. And then later, those restrictions were expanded into other areas with regard to semiconductors and microchips, and also the ultra UV lithography machines that we get from the Netherlands. Restrictions on those as well. So the US seems very much set upon attempting to hobble China's economic growth through these means. Now, about 18 months ago when all this started, Philip and I said that this would be a disaster. Like, all it would do would be to spur the Chinese on to develop their own indigenous industries that can provide the same thing. And while this would take a while, they are the kind of masters of modern manufacturing. And once they cracked it, they would then have a massive internal market. And also they would likely compete with the Western companies that were previously selling to China elsewhere in the world. And therefore, it wouldn't be a good thing, especially as this industry is hugely capital intensive. And therefore, reductions in profit or increases in competition can potentially reduce the amount of capital you have to invest in R&D, which you need to do constantly. I believe you're roughly on the same page that this has been an error from the United States, and the Chinese are indeed making progress. What sort of progress are the Chinese making? How far in the kind of the research, development, production and sales loop are they behind, say, TSMC and some of the American producers? How long is it before China reaches parity, or will they ever reach parity?
Yeah, so this is a very important topic. The official U.S. position just in the last 5 years has shifted from we are competing with China to we explicitly say we are trying to contain them. We are literally trying to contain the economic aspirations of 1.4 billion people, of 20% of the world's population, right? It's pretty drastic for the government of the United States to say. We're actually actively trying to suppress these people, right? So the chip war is a specific example of this. And I agree with the description that you just gave. These guys in Washington who, again, I think do not understand technology and innovation said, we're going to kneecap these guys. We're going to restrict the certain products. Like, for example, we no longer allow them to buy extreme ultraviolet lithography machines from ASML which is a Dutch company. We no longer allow them to buy certain DUV, deep ultraviolet lithography machines from Japanese companies. We are going to restrict their access to certain software that's used for chip design, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of sanctions. And the rationale for this is actually, the official rationale is that these things are used in military products, weapons and such, and that's why we're cutting them off. But it's really crazy because the bleeding edge chips at the time when that was the chip war started were really mainly just used in mobile phones. That's where you really needed the smallest nanometer feature sizes for power efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a consumer product, not actually military products. Military products usually use legacy chips because you need very robust, proven technology, and military product design cycles are long, and they last for a long time because you need to stockpile large numbers of those weapons, et cetera. So even the superficial reasoning for why they were doing it, that didn't make any sense. But the key tech innovation dynamic that Washington overlooked, that Jake Sullivan, who has no science degrees, is a Harvard Law School graduate, the main thing they overlooked is that within that Chinese ecosystem, there are many competitors trying to win market share for chip design software, for lithography machine, for wafer production, for quality control checking of the chips after they're made. The semiconductor industry is really in a way, the most complex industry in the world. What people in Washington didn't realize is that the Chinese government had already gone through a cycle using something called the Big Fund, where they realized, we're spending more importing chips than we are importing oil. And when we make an iPhone for Apple, there's so much of the profit, the value add is in the chip and not in what the workers do here to assemble the phone, right? So the government there was already aware of this, and they'd already tried a previous cycle of trying to build up the semiconductor supply chain within China, trying to produce national champions and successful tech companies in China that could compete with the industry leaders that were mainly based outside China. But they had failed. And if you're a startup guy, so if you actually have Silicon Valley experience, you understand exactly what happened. I'm TSMC or I'm SMIC, and I have to make these chips, and it's an incredibly brutal competition between me and Samsung and Intel and TSMC and UMC. And we have to hit a certain price point. We have to hit a certain production quality level. Am I going to gamble on a startup to supply a piece of that supply chain or something that's used in the process? Am I going to gamble on their new technology and their product? Or am I going to keep buying it from ASML? Am I going to keep buying it from Lam Research in California? Am I going to keep buying it from Applied Materials in California? So even if the local Chinese company is as good as Applied Materials for a particular, component of the production process, I'm very, very leery. That startup could run out of money. It's a small company. There could be instability. If they fuck up my process, I'm out billions of dollars, and my customer AMD that I'm making this chip for is going to be really pissed off, right? So there's a natural reason why it's very tough for new entrants to break into these kinds of competitions. But the moment the U.S. says, hey, we're not letting Applied Materials supply this to you anymore, or there's a risk that in the future we'll just cut off these devices from you from Applied Materials, all of a sudden your risk calculus changes. All of a sudden you embrace the little guy down the street. Maybe you even went to Tsinghua with that guy, the founder of that other company, and you bring him in and you're like, okay, we're working together now. Because now there's another risk I can't tolerate. I cannot tolerate the risk that somebody zeroes out my access to a key component in my process, in my supply chain. So now you and I are buddies. Okay. So that creation of a, coherent coordinate, solving the coordination problem for all this Chinese ecosystem, Jake Sullivan and dumb people in Washington did that. And since then, the Chinese semiconductor industry has made great strides. And although they're still behind on the frontier, the absolute frontier level processes, they've completely indigenized the supply chain for legacy chips. So 24 nanometers, 40 nanometers and up. And those are most of the chips that are in your TV set, your car, your refrigerator, your missile. Those are the bulk of the market, actually. And now the Chinese have basically caught up so that they're now, after TSMC, The number two player, in a sense, in this whole industry globally is now SMIC, which is based in Shanghai. As you mentioned, when I was in Shanghai just a week ago, I visited SMIC and had some conversations with some top leadership at SMIC. So I think they're quietly confident that they're eventually going to close the gap, and I universally heard from people in China, technologists and investors and people in the tech ecosystem, that this chip war is going to turn out to be a huge mistake for the United States.
Yeah, I just really want to echo, I don't envy the National Security Advisor having a law degree, although it would be nice to have more people who can do algebra in positions of power. But I really hope that the Trump administration, even if they have to stock the layers of the senior bureaucracy with law degrees, because this seems to be the way of government in the West, at least consult people. You, Steve, even an economist. Okay, we suck sometimes, but consult somebody, please. Lawyers, their instinct is to make laws, and it's like, oh, we'll make a law about that and it'll create reality. They're all postmodernists in a sense. But here's a broader question. That was great. That's a really good overview of what's going on in China in terms of the chips. I'd only say that, I'm sure you implied it anyway, they're going to catch up in like 5 or 10 years, probably, because technology is just technology. You can't ban the printing press, right? The Catholic Church tried it. They got the Reformation. But in terms of kind of overall US-China relations, I know it's a very broad topic, but obviously we're in the kind of, I don't want to put you in our weirdo group, but like, I think we're in the kind of like, we're not crazy anti-China, but we're also, not like on the left side of the aisle or whatever. It doesn't even mean anything anymore because everybody hates China now, I guess, in the West. But so I guess we don't hate China, and like we actually think that they're doing interesting things and their economy is going to take off. So from that perspective, like, how do you broadly see US-Chinese relations developing over the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I think there's a lot of momentum for things to get worse. So, there could be more decoupling between the economies, tariffs, more and more pressure on scientists not to collaborate with their Chinese counterparts and US companies not to collaborate with Chinese companies. So I think there's a lot of momentum in that direction. I think the most likely outcome here, there's one big chunk of probability space, unlike World War III, but let's not go there. A likely outcome is U.S. is going to try as hard as it can to, quote, contain or suppress China. They're going to fail. And then eventually there'll probably have to be some kind of deal where the U.S. has huge budget deficits. They sort of effectively sell Taiwan to China. They make a kind of deal. And basically the Chinese agree to keep kind of supporting the U.S. economy, supporting U.S. deficits, et cetera, for a while. Eventually, from my perspective, the U.S. is still militarily very secure. We have 2 oceans. We have the most advanced military in the world. We don't really have that much to be afraid of. We have a very dynamic economy. We attract most of the best brains from around the world to come here. There's every reason for us to just be confident and say, yeah, we can live with a resurgent China. It doesn't have to be an existential risk for us. We can still thrive in a world where Chinese development continues.
Yeah, I suppose that brings us on to the last 20 or 30 years US foreign policy, because that's very much not the view that the US has taken. And in fact, since the end of the Cold War, or certainly since the end of the 1990s, Washington has taken a view that it can barely tolerate people with a different political system. It can barely tolerate people who see the world in a slightly different way. It can barely tolerate people who don't strive to move toward liberal democracy, who don't open up their markets entirely to capital and investment. I sound left-wing when I say this, but I'm really not. I don't mind capital per se. I think it's a very good thing. I'm just saying that it was something that the US insisted on. And this has created a foreign policy that's almost hyper-interventionist, certainly in the Middle East, but now, of course, on the eastern approaches of Europe as well. And some of us believe that this has really significantly weakened the West's position to cope with the rise of China, like to hold the line on the first island chain, so to speak. It's going to be far more difficult to do after they've spent so much political capital, expended so many munitions, and spent so much money on peripheral areas such as the Middle East and Europe's eastern approaches. This has also had secondary effects as well in creating a kind of anti-hegemonic alliance, mainly between Russia, which is a natural resources superpower, and China, which is, of course, the world's manufacturing superpower, but also other countries involved in that as well. Is the US really in a position where it could challenge China? Is the US in a position where it could take a very kind of John Mearsheimer realist view of China and challenge them? Is it not a bit too late for that?
It's a great question. So in 2019, when I was last in China before this trip, and I was actually we were visiting Beijing University, and I was staying in the visitor apartments that they provide for visitors. I spoke to a lot of technologists. I spoke to a lot of academics, scientists, et cetera. And at that time in 2019, the main topic of conversation, which just arose again and again, was where is the tipping point beyond which, even if the US tries really hard, but the Chinese respond effectively, I mean, they don't do stupid things, okay? At what point do we reach this tipping point where China can no longer be contained by the United States, right? And the consensus in 2019 was we're at that tipping point now. We are at that or just slightly beyond that tipping point. And now in 2024, people are just quietly confident. People I spoke to are just like, well, they could make trouble for us. They could cause a recession in China. They could, maybe get the Japanese to do something stupid, or they could maybe try to cause a conflict in Taiwan. I think Xi has explicitly said that to some European leaders. He's explicitly said that maybe to von der Leyen that the Americans are trying to get us into starting a war over Taiwan, but we won't do it. So there are pitfalls that China can fall into, but largely if they play their cards right, the view from there is it's past the tipping point now. I think this is somewhat reflected actually in the confidence with which Xi now speaks to Biden and other people. Like he's just not taking any shit from them anymore. In fact, in the last bilateral, I think he literally said to them, hey, stop lying to us. You guys tell us stuff at the meetings that you're going to do X, but then you don't do X. Your actual implementation is not X, and just cut it out. So I think it's kind of reflected in thinking of leadership there now.
Can I just ask you, this is a very specific question, but you've been around the block in these kind of investment meetings and stuff like that. When I started my career in finance, like 15 or whatever it was, 10, 15 years ago, like everyone knew China could just dump dollar assets, right? They have an enormous treasury bond holding, massive reserve assets. And if you asked anybody in finance, and I used to work in America, I used to work in Boston, and if you asked anyone in finance, Goldman guys or whatever, who often staff treasury, by the way, it's kind of a like rotating door at a senior level of the civil service there. If you ask them, they'd say, yeah, I mean, like we can't screw around with China too much because if they really get mad, they don't have to nuke us. They just have to like dump all their dollar reserves. And like that's no less true today than it is before. Look, I get that they can that doing so would have a big impact on China's trade and development model, the mercantilism that we talked about earlier and so on. But they do kind of have that soft nuclear option. Like it's actually, they possess the power that Western leaders thought they possessed over Russia when they froze the reserves, and it totally didn't work because, hey, wait a minute, Russia runs big trade surpluses, so that's obviously not going to work. But they genuinely could crash the dollar. And as you say, there was this weird tipping point after 2019 or something where everybody just forgot everything and everyone's mind was blanked about everything. Do you have any sense on that? I know it's a super specific issue, but it's just a bit of a bugbear of mine. Did you hear that kind of thing, 10, 15 years ago? And then did you just see it disappear? And what's your reaction to it?
Well, Philip, again, I just find you incredibly insightful. So yes, this is a very key question. So that particular thing, could China just dump all the treasuries? I think at first order, what you say is true. And then as you acknowledge, we don't quite understand what the second and third order consequences of that would be. I think the Chinese leadership, because they feel like things are going pretty well, they don't feel like they need to take that risk because who knows what happens the next day, right? And, maybe your economists are telling you on the one hand, this could happen on the other hand, and then I have a third hand. But I think the leadership never felt like that was a particularly good move just because of the unpredictability of doing that. And what I'm hearing, this is something I learned on this trip, which is super interesting to me, is people are kind of now saying in China that we actually want a managed decline of the dollar. We're not going to like create mBridge or some digital currency and just try to undermine the dollar and get the Saudis to do something radical. I hear that they see a managed decline and they want to help manage it. That they just feel like it's in no one's interest for there to be a discontinuity in the fate of the United States. Because after all, it's a crazy country with nuclear missiles, right? So, which is used to being number one, right? And so they want to have a smooth managed decline. I had not heard that before.
Yeah, I think I've heard that a couple of times. This idea, in China, that look, you guys have been number one for a long time. You're not going to be for much longer, but we're going to help you. We're going to help you with your decline, perhaps in the same way that some European powers have declined in the past and done so rather more gracefully than others. But I'm not sure that America necessarily has to decline. I think that the US has just astounding natural resources. And I don't just mean the stuff that you can dig out of the ground. I mean, your geographical position, your human resources. You don't have a great total fertility rate, but the population is still growing due to immigration, for better or for worse. You still attract, as you touched on earlier, some of the world's greatest minds, which is also a good thing. You have a lot of the world's greatest universities. You still have some industry and the potential to have more. You do have a lot of those natural resources you dig out of the ground. You can feed yourself. I mean, this is a relatively stable political situation. No matter what the legacy media try to tell us, by global standards, it is a really stable political system. No matter what we Britons say, my visits from the US suggest a great culture as well. It seems that things aren't going right at the moment. And one of the ideas to get it going right is this kind of counter elite that's emerged from the west coast of the US, the kind of the high-tech world in California. And your friend Dominic Cummings basically said that these guys had said, look, we can't live like this anymore. The way the government's being run badly means that we cannot stay out of this. We need to go in and try to sort things out, try to make it run more efficiently. And by doing that, we'll get the country in the right direction. And, looking at your Twitter feed, I think a week ago, you put out a call for academics and industrialists and technology experts to DM you to see if they wanted to get involved in this. And I assume this is the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, what it would involve, what your role in it would be, perhaps? And how you could see that working to get America, back on track. Maybe the idea of the US, but run as efficiently as Singapore. I mean, that would be a thing to behold, I'm sure.
Yeah, let me react to the earlier comment, the first comments you made before I answer the question. And I completely agree with what you just said. So when I use the word decline vis-a-vis America, I have to be very careful about what I mean. So there's some relative decline because we're not as great right now as we used to be. I see no reason we can't have a very affluent, dynamic country for many, many decades, generations.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a decline in relative terms now. I mean, Britain is objectively, British people objectively live better now than they did in 1892. But relatively, we're nowhere near where we were in 1892, right? That's a whole different thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think America can thrive. The issue is we just went through a period post-Soviet collapse where we were the sole hegemon by a huge factor. That might not continue, but the general well-being of an average American doesn't have to necessarily decline very much, or it doesn't have to decline at all. So anyway, just to clarify that, the main tension here is: are we going to be the title of your show is Multipolarity, right? So are we going to live in a world still dominated by one hegemon called America, or are we going to have more multipolarity? That's the real issue with China. I don't think China is really causing America to suddenly not be able to build bridges or do various things, right? So just want to be precise about what's meant by decline here. Now, in terms of what's wrong with America and how we would fix it, and could the Trump administration fix it, et cetera, I think for somebody my age, I'm probably older than you guys, but it does seem like American capabilities and effectiveness have declined a lot since the Cold War, and we just can't do stuff. Some of it you could blame on China because our manufacturing prowess in dealing with real world physical things has declined because we outsource so much of it, right? So if we try to build a bridge or a high-speed train or whatever, we just screw it up, right? One big example of this is the CHIPS Act, which directionally, I actually think industrial policy is okay if it's practiced smartly. In fact, you may need to have industrial policy if your competitors have industrial policy. But I was never enthusiastic about what the Biden administration was doing because I just felt like, yeah, but they're just going to squander all this money. We're not actually going to succeed. And lo and behold, Intel's, close to bankruptcy. So what was our poster child going to be? Like the CHIPS Act would have to have a U.S. champion that can actually fab chips, but there's literally no U.S. company that can fab CPUs right now, and Intel's on the brink of bankruptcy. So that's an example of like, I'm just worried about our just overall effectiveness as a country right now. As far as the new administrations, I had some discussions with people on the transition team, and I was actually involved a little bit in the earlier transition in 2016. At that time, you may recall Peter Thiel was the guy who brought like huge binders full of talented people from Silicon Valley that potentially could staff positions in the Trump administration. But then eventually, I think Peter sort of stopped being that enthusiastic about Trump, or at least ended up playing a lower key role and sort of disappeared from the scene. Here we have Elon taking the place of Peter. If you remember back to 2016, Peter was very prominent in that first transition. Now Elon is. But just in general, like if for anyone who's never been around a presidential transition, it's chaos. And there's tons of horse trading about these high profile, fancy positions, like Treasury Secretary or Attorney General or what have you. But you have to go further down to really build a fully effective new administration, especially if that administration is trying to do something different than what was done in Washington before. Someone on the transition team told me just a week or two ago that in the first Trump administration, I forgot exactly what the time scale was, but in this particular fixed time scale, they were only able to get 500 people through. And Biden, just as a counterexample, got 1,600 people through during the same time period in his administration. And they're hoping they'll be closer to Biden than to Trump 1. And so that tweet I put out was just because people on the transition team were saying, yeah, if you know talented people who want to serve, especially Silicon Valley people or people from academic science or science research, tech research, send us the resumes. And so that's what that was all about. It wasn't a specific thing with DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency. I would have to say jury's out. We'll see how well Trump 2 executes relative to Trump 1. If you read the media really carefully, and if you read alternative media, you know that there were very explicit efforts by the, quote, what we now call the deep state. At the time, if you used the word deep state, people thought you were a nut. But there were very strong efforts by the deep state in 2016 to keep Trump from being able to appoint people he wanted to appoint. And there were lots of dirty tricks played and stalling tactics and stuff like this. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen this time.
I guess I'll ask you a really hard question, and feel free to just say, I have no idea, because I have no idea either. Let's frame it in the format of the CHIPS Act. So I always recommend to listeners, if you want to understand the CHIPS Act, read Julius Krein's article, Where the Chips Fell, American Affairs, brilliant piece, explaining what happened to the ill-fated CHIPS Act. It was horse trading in Congress, I think, and it was combined with a lot of corporate leaders who can't work together, sadly, and who don't see their industry as an industry, but as a series of competitors and so on. Do you think that there's a way to overcome? You're an industry guy. You're much closer to this than I am. You're also an American, so I'm not in DC at the moment. Do you see a way to do that? Let's say you get the staffing done, you focus on a singular issue, let's say chips, but it can be anything really. And then you look at Congress and you're like, okay, there's the money apportioning body, and it's full of people who are like trying to get money for themselves and their constituents. And then you have the industry, which, at least in the case of the chips, and I'd say in the case of a lot of American industry really, is very fragmented. Do you think that there's a path there to kind of like get like a railway cart shunted on a track and get it to move?
It's such a complex question, and the political machinery that it has to pass through is so horrible that I can't possibly really predict what Trump 2 would be capable of. I would say, let me give us like a success scenario that's kind of plausible. I don't think this is actually going to happen, but let me just say it. So let's suppose there were a thing that Trump really wanted to do in industrial policy. So say he wanted, at the end of my term, I want to see at least the green shoots or some significant progress toward U.S. fabrication of chips, because there's literally, other than some memory chips, there's literally no U.S. fabrication of logic chips right now. Is that okay? Maybe it's okay. Maybe we don't mind it all being done in Taiwan or something, but maybe we don't want that for geostrategic reasons, right? So if Trump just said, I'm putting the chips down here, I'm going to use up tons of capital, I'm going to force this bill to go through without all these crazy riders and horse trading and pork barrel stuff. I'm going to appoint someone like Elon, who's just extremely capable and cares a lot about this getting done. Could they do that? Yeah, maybe. But how many of those things could they do? Not very many. I think that would be like a Herculean best case effort from the administration.
Well, I suppose on that semi-positive note, or at least not crushingly negative note, we should thank you, Steve, for spending this hour and a half with us, and ask if you have anything that you would like to draw listeners' attention to, any recent essays, podcasts, anything that you feel people should be reading.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think you guys are focused on all the most important issues about how at a macro global level, how the world's going to evolve in the next decade or two. These last two episodes, Letter from Beijing and Letter from Shanghai, if you enjoyed the conversation that we just had today, I think your listeners might enjoy those two podcast episodes. During the trip in China, I was there for 3 weeks and I did lots of traveling and stuff. I tweeted out sort of in live stream style. I'd made many tweets while I was there. There are links in the show notes for the podcast that I just mentioned. You can find all these tweets and you might enjoy looking at them because a lot of them have photos of stuff in China that you might find interesting.
I would say that all of our listeners who are interested in interesting things should listen to Manifold, which is MANI fold, all one word, because quite apart from your letters from your travelogue from Beijing, you have really fascinating guests that touch on a lot of interesting subjects, a lot of which, frankly, Steve, I don't understand. I don't necessarily have the same intellectual horsepower as you and some of your guests, but still, the podcast is something that sparks ideas and sparks interest and touches on a lot of esoteric and fascinating areas. So everyone should really listen to Manifold. And with that, I shall say thank you very much, Steve Hsu, and hope to have you back soon, I guess, at some stage.
Yeah, would love to come back. I really enjoyed this conversation.
And I, for one, will be listening to the Letters of Beijing